on page 46, and I think I'm just going to do this quotation and then talk about some other things in more detail that aren't in the book. In the middle of 46, Daryl Falk writes, I have a real problem with the way Todd Wood almost capriciously dismisses the volumes of evidence for evolution. If you ignore the overwhelming amount of evidence, see, the interesting thing is, and it needs to be said, Todd doesn't ignore the evidence, he acknowledges the evidence. But he does dismiss, I think it is almost capriciously dismisses the volumes of evidence. And as Falk says, evidence coming in for a theory from all different corners and disciplines, all of which point in the same direction and are fully and totally consistent with each other. If you ignore this overwhelming body of evidence, I'm not sure that what you're doing is science anymore. It may be interesting, but it's not science. I tend to agree. And I do think that the root of the problem lies, as I've said before, in Todd Wood's assumption, along with many other people, young earth creationists in particular, that the Bible, without error or inerrantly, in all matters, functions as a book of knowledge for ancient history, for, cosmology, that is our understanding of the universe, for our planetary history, the history of life, and especially of human life. Is the Bible doing that? I think the answer is no. We can talk more about what I think the Bible is doing in classes to come. I'm having a little lunch right now. I shouldn't do this right now, but I'm going to do one, and then I'm going to quit. Coco trying to get my lunch. Now, let's go back for a moment and talk about different theories of interpretation of the Bible, especially of Genesis. So, the point of view upheld by Todd Wood and other young earth creationists like him is that the universe was essentially created in 6 days. I guess we can, if we want, we can just restrict it to the earth. But I think Genesis is, it's talking about all the observable world for people of that time. So, at nighttime, sun, moon and stars. During the daytime, the sun. They could see the water of the Mediterranean Sea. They could see, oases in the desert where the water came up out of the ground. So they assumed that, there is water under there, right? They assumed that it was just like one great big huge reservoir of water that was like that water out there in the Mediterranean. It was all one big body of water, including the water up over the firmament. The young earth creationist would say that this was all done essentially in 6 days. And then there'll be a little bit of variation on how long ago. It's usually between 6 and 10,000 years. This number, the 6,000 especially, is achieved by then looking closely at the genealogies, first of all in Genesis, and maybe then they go on and do some more genealogical work where they, add up the numbers that a certain person lived before this person had this child, and then you would start with that person and how many years before they had, their children. So it's basically a matter of adding up some numbers and making sure you don't overlap in your counting. But again, as though you could use this as a way to determine how old the earth is. Again, so you have these people who go 6 to 10,000 years, and it wouldn't just be the Earth; it would have to be the universe. Well, then you have people that are uncomfortable with that because they're pretty sure they're convinced that the world is older than this, than 6 to 10,000 years, but they still want to assume that the Bible is a scientific text. So probably the most popular and enduring approach on that one is the argument that the days of Genesis aren't 24-hour days. There is the slightest bit of support for this in the sense that the Hebrew word translated as day, and that word is yom, usually spelled in English Y-O-M. Like Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur is Day of Atonement. So Yom means day, and it is true that day doesn't always mean 24-hour day, like our experience of a day, because there's you could talk about in the day of King so-and-so, or the day of the Lord. So it can mean like a period, kind of a period of time. The problem is, so the idea would be, well, that day, those days aren't really just 24-hour days. They could be any period of time. Okay, would they be equal periods of time? One would kind of have to think so. Well, then how long of a period of time are we talking? Let's say that our Earth is we'll just go with 4 billion years old. 4 billion years old. But if it were created basically in one of those periods of time, say so we have 6 days, and those days are equal periods of time, we would divide 4 billion by 6 and get what? About 600,000? 6 times 600,000? Well, I think that might get us close to 4 billion. Well, let's say then, each of those days is 4 billion. Now you're stuck with, 660,000. Now you're stuck with the problem that on one of those days you have plants. Plants are on the land before the sun. That's a problem. Because then you're going to have to postulate that for hundreds of thousands of years we had plant life on planet Earth without a sun. I forgot I said I wasn't going to do that anymore. The problem with that isn't that a wild stretch of the imagination? We would have to postulate. This just becomes mental gymnastics of desperation. Well, during that day, while there was no sun, but yet plants were growing on the land, we won't even call it the earth, on the land, God was giving them light or sustaining those plants some other way. Well, after a while, it just seems like a lot of special pleading and making our minds do mental gymnastics to avoid the likely scenario, the likely conclusion that we shouldn't be reading Genesis for scientific information. But so you have the young Earth theory, or you have, and then this one, which would sometimes be called like the day/yom theory, where these days are not, I'll say again, typical days, but could be these immense stretches of time. Another problem with this is there's just no sense in the text that you get whatsoever that what is meant are anything other than days like people experience, especially since the it ends with the seventh day as the day of rest. And I'm just willing to argue that this text is not about figuring out how old the earth is or trying to make days be really long so that it'll fit better with our scientific estimations of the earth's age. But rather, it's about the Sabbath. Genesis 1 has a whole bunch of sevens, patterns of sevens in it, more than I can even trouble you with now, but all of which suggests that at the heart of this is Jewish observance of the seventh day or the Sabbath day, especially in a situation where the Jews are under Babylonian cultural influence in exile, where the temptation would be just to conform to the gods of Babylon and to Babylonian culture. And so you have Genesis 1 as a document of resistance in its affirmation that the God of Israel is the creator of all things, that all of creation is God's temple, so that the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in Jerusalem should not be understood as the destruction of God, because God is far bigger than our temple, and that in fact God's real temple, I'll say again, is all creation. Again, that's not a scientific statement. It's a theological conviction. And it is not in competition with scientific descriptions of things. So, nonetheless, you have the young earth theory, then you have this day yom theory, where the days are more than 24 hours, much more, or at least some of the days are. I mean, it gets very difficult. It's hard. Then the only other theory I know of that tries to read Genesis literally, but also take the evidence for the age of the universe seriously, is called the gap theory. It's not a terribly popular theory, but let me run it by you really quickly. I actually have known one guy. I had him as a student in a master's degree program up in Idaho, Northwest Nazarene. So probably about, 30 years ago. This was a pretty educated pastor who was convinced, especially by astronomy, like, the amount of time it takes for light to travel, and the fact that scientists or astronomers, through measuring redshift in light, could come up with pretty good estimates regarding how long it's taken for certain light to reach us. So some of you may know, I think it's 8 minutes for the light from the sun to reach our planet. I think that's the right number, which would mean that whenever we look up at the sun, we're actually looking at the sun that existed 8 minutes ago. So we're always a little bit behind. And obviously, the farther into space we go, we're looking at light that's traveled sometimes, millions of years. And so that evidence would suggest we don't have a young universe, unless we think that God sort of created some light 6,000 years ago, like as though it had been on its way for millions of years, which would really not be a very flattering portrait of God as one who kind of creates false evidence. For what purpose? So this pastor, who was convinced by the evidence of astronomy that we live in a universe of, I think he thought like 13, 14 billion years old, and that's pretty old. But he also believed that Genesis 1 and the genealogies give us a young earth. So I'm going to pause here and come back and just talk about this gap theory a little bit more and maybe say a few more things. But here's a good place to pause.